This Markkanen extension is really interesting because how closely it fell to the NBA trade deadline. Smartly decided to wait until August 7th, where he was eligible on August 6th to sign this deal. The total is 5 years, $238 million, $220 million in new money. So his contract for next season, 24-25, increased from $18 million to a little bit over $42 million. And the Jazz used their cap space that they had, some of the cap space, to make that possible. So Lauri gets that increase in his salary for next season, and then they tack on 4 more years, and that's going to start 25-26 at somewhere in the neighborhood of $46 million for the first year of the extension, and then it rolls out from there. This is the 13th contract per Bobby Marks to be renegotiated and extended, and this is the 5th since January 2023. So not many instances of this in the entire history of the NBA, or at least not in recent history, but it is happening a little bit more frequently because we've seen 5 in less than 2 years. CBA now allows teams to have a little bit more power to keep their players in an extension with that 140% now, which is an extra little incentive there to get players up to closer to the salary that they're worth. So there's a higher chance of retaining players and you're avoiding free agency. So that definitely helps out in this scenario and also helps out in the Jarrett Allen extension, which we'll get to later. Lauri cannot be traded for 6 months. That puts him past the trade deadline for this year. So don't have to worry about that, that's pretty cool for him. He has the security. And then I'm sure the Jazz will revisit next season, depending on what happens this season with that whole deal.
When I wrote about it, I pretty much weighed their options as far as, if obviously he was one of the key pieces in trade rumors this offseason. If he was going to be traded, I thought that it would happen before the renegotiation happened, because essentially what would happen is if he got renegotiated on August 6th, that was the only day that essentially he could be renegotiated and extended and still be traded before the trade deadline this year. So if that happened, essentially what Lauri would be saying is, sure, let's sign this big extension, and then everyone can just talk about me being traded all season. And I just didn't believe that would happen. I think he wanted to wait the day. He would sit comfortably for a year. He'd have his contract. And from there, I just think that, it's an expensive contract, but as far as contracts go in this league these days, I think that it just makes sense. He's making his max deal. And what happens is at that point, they essentially only have their rookie scale contracts coming up. So they're going to have a ton of flexibility. And as the raises are only 8% off of his initial increase in salary from the 25-26 year. So as everyone just assumes that the salary cap is going to go up 10% every year, with that dip in salary, his salary is just going to go down and down and down every year. So it's that 30% max, and it's just going to dip down. It looks like it's going to be 26% by the end of it. And for a player of his ilk, I think that's somewhat of a valuable contract. And what I said before that this all happened is the only downside of signing him at this point, you can't trade him this year. You can always trade him in the offseason, next offseason, right? And then at that point, the only downside is, look, you're trying to go for Cooper Flag. It's a strong draft next year. And if you're trying to tank, he's going to help you get more wins. That's the only real downside. But after so many years of trying to tank at some points at the end of the year, you can't do that every single year. And even so, you can't let him walk. And if you hadn't traded him at this point, you're not going to trade him for max value on a 1-year deal. And like you said, Aaron, if you trade him to another team, most likely it's not a team with cap space, so they can't renegotiate and extend him, right? So there's no real option where you can trade him away and then they have the ability of what you just did. So, which is the whole point of this 6-month bar from trading, right? So it makes a lot of sense that you do this now, you let it play out, you assess your young players, you see where your talent's at, and then in the 2025 offseason, you kind of see where you're at. If it's worth trading him at that point, fine. If he's worth sticking around, then great. You move forward at that point.
So the first thing that I think you got to look at is what was he going to get offered next summer, and I think it was pretty clear that he was probably going to get max level offers. He could have gotten 4 for 200 from another team, and that's basically what he's getting on those last 4 years. For Utah, I was like, they were definitely shopping him around. There was rumors, they were reporting that they were doing that, and they were probably looking for some crazy offer that they did not get. And I think they got in that process. I'm sure they got several pieces of intel. One, what teams are willing to pay for him, which is max level money, and two, that he probably would still have good trade value on this contract. So they went ahead and gave him the most he was able to get was 5 years, 250 million. He gets 5 for 238, so he gets about 12 million less than the max. And the biggest difference is, so he's getting the max the first 2 years, and there's no player option, there are no incentives, no bonuses, so there's not really much room for him to make even more money if he were to get traded. Anyway, yeah, he didn't get the trade bonus. And so the biggest thing for Utah is one, they didn't get there's no player option, which is probably good on their end. And then the last 3 years, they're below max level money. Not too much below max, roughly like 3 million a year below each of those seasons' respective maxes. That's where I think Utah is like what they kind of get out of this. Where right now, I don't know if his trade value I don't know if it's easier to trade him now that he's going to be at the max this year, next year. But if he's still on Utah in 3 years, 3 and 4 and 5, that's when I think it gets a little relatively cheaper when as the cap goes up, and that's when so it might be a little. He might have even more trade value then. He's got more years on his deal, and it's still sub max. I think it was a good deal for him. He got pretty close to the maximum amount he was able to get. That's the main thing to take away for the Jazz is maybe some people got some sticker shock seeing that number, but it's still, but I still think there's some benefits. It's still a good deal for their end. Now, and clearly, yeah, he didn't want to be traded, so he never had to agree to anything on August 6th. That's why they waited a day. Nothing the Jazz could have done about that. But yeah, we'll see what happens. Sounds like the Jazz will again play this game where they're going to overachieve at some point, and then they got to shut things down, and hopefully they get a better than like the 10th overall pick of this year, and then we'll see what happens as far as Lauri's fate, because now that he's locked up, it's up to Utah whatever they want to do with him.